Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. Welcome to the CMS in Touch Hot of the Press series. Please join Dr. Laura Bierema, Dr. Jamie Callahan, Dr. Carole Elliott, Dr. Tomika Greer, Dr. Joshua Collins. Eunbi Sim to hear the reflections on the new book, Human Resource Development, Critical Perspectives and Practices. They will outline the unique contribution the book makes to the field of human resource development, particularly the inclusion of critical perspectives to problematize the dominant paradigms that underpin much HRE theorizing. Meantime, may I request everyone to please put on their names where they are joining from, and we thank you for joining us today. Before I hand you all over to our panelists, here are some housekeeping rules. I request all attendees to please post your questions in the Q&A button. This should be at the bottom of the screen, not in chat box. And the CMS in Touch team members will ensure that the question is shared with our panelists. You may post your questions at any time during the webinar. The plan is that we'll listen to the authors team, then have a round of Q&A where all questions will be addressed. I now invite the authors team to take it from here. So,
Good day, everyone. And Eunbi, could you please queue up our slides? While that's happening, I'd like to offer you a warm welcome. I'm Dr. Laura Bierema, and I thank you so much for your time and joining this book launch. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia, and we appreciate your time and the important work you do in our field, and especially thank you to the CMS in Touch team for hosting us today. My program at the University of Georgia is Adult Learning, Leadership, and Organization Development. And my task with my esteemed and beloved colleague, Jamie Callahan, is going to launch the book with me. Jamie?
I'm Jamie Callahan, Professor of Organization and Ethics at the Durham University Business School in the UK. And we're really excited to get started with giving you a few comments about the book and then sharing with you some more information about what we were trying to do and what we're sharing in this book.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much and welcome again. So Jamie and I, have been inspired by a career-long dissatisfaction with what we consider to be dominant, instrumental masculine, and performative models and the discourse behind it that describe our field. For example, the infamous three-legged stool of theory being economics, systems, and psychological theories on a rug of ethics, which was added later, or the binary polarizing learning versus performance debate that was never intended to describe reality, but has been talked into being, or referring to people such as brokers of productivity or preparing them to unleash their productive selves in the name of profit and performance. And we were not teaching these ideas in our courses or to our students, and it wasn't really the HRD we practiced or envisioned.
Yeah. And so we also represent, in addition to the background of how we came to this place, we also represent the blending of two teams. We were both approached by Routledge to write this book, and one team was from the UK and one was from the US. And rather than write two books that competed with one another and took a national level focus, we wanted to expand beyond our silos. While we include quite a bit from the US and UK and some tiptoes beyond into other countries' experiences of HRD, we expect that our second edition of the book will expand even further. But this is our first start and foray into really trying to do a more global perspective of critical HRD.
Okay, next slide, please. So our agenda for today, which we've already started, is we'll give you a few more introductory lines on the book itself, and then each of the authors and our esteemed research assistant, Eunbi Sim, will give you a brief taste of each section of the book and feature some of the special tools we've included. And then we'll make time for questions and comments at the end. All right, next slide. And I think we've already covered this slide, so we'll go on. All right, so the framework for the book really expands a book chapter that Jamie and I wrote in 2014. And we were attempting to reframe HRD from a critical perspective and change our thinking from what we call the holy trinity of HRD, where we think of training and development, career development, and organization development as the key functions. We were really more interested in the active practices of HRD. And so we came up with these 4 circles of relating, learning, changing, and organizing as activities that happen and theories behind those activities in our field. And so our reconceptualization of HRD theory and practice was really to name and think about the complex and contested spaces where people work. And then we also considered 4 areas, and we can go on to the next slide, of the social context, the stakeholders, the process, and the method of how HRD was done.
And we also felt that the prevailing theories and discourses of the Holy Trinity really simplified HRD, and it ignored the messiness and paradox and challenge of serving humans when at times the organization worked against their interests, like keeping people motivated while at the same time we were downsizing them, or the mixed messages that people were receiving during the COVID-19 pandemic and continue to receive about remote work versus returning to the office, as if what happened in 2019 was never ending.
Indeed. And so we really tried to create a way of viewing HRD that was active and acknowledging of the challenges of working in this area. And let me just say that doing this was not easy because, we really did attempt to rethink our field and create new language for how we think about our work. And this was not the work of one person, and hence our wonderful team that we brought together, where we aimed for diversity in thought, generation, and experience. And I really think that the story of how we wrote this book and worked together is probably as interesting, if not more interesting, than the book. And I do want to also say that in addition to the framework, and maybe we can go back a slide, I got a little ahead of myself, Eunbi. We start the book with an introductory section, and then we end it with a section on holistic HRD. And then these 4 circles you see are the middle parts of the book. I also really want to acknowledge the valuable contribution to our thinking and our model is the work by Collins, McFadden, Rocco, and Mathis in their 2015 article in Human Resource Development Review. They built on this model you see before you, and they proposed a 5th way of being, which is advocating as relating, learning, changing, and organizing on behalf of others. And although I don't know if Collins et al. Would fully agree, we see advocacy as implied in this model and really have made an effort to talk about how do you put these ideas into practice. I also want to underscore that Collins et al. Made a really important contribution to our field by urging the field to be more responsive to issues transgender workers face and engage in more advocacy. And so I think that advocacy is the why of this model that you see here and the textbook in terms of advocating for more humane, just, and humanly sustainable organizations through critical HRD. Jamie.
All right, so now to give you a flavor of our intention and ultimately the book from the introductory lines, we say this book covers the basic tenets of HRD, interrogates the dominant paradigms and practices of the field, teaches readers how to critically assess HRD practices and outcomes, and provides some critical alternatives. The text also addresses HRD as a contested field and the importance for HRD professionals to reflect on their values, maintain their sanity, and retain employment while attempting to do this difficult work that serves multiple stakeholders. And so although it's written from a critical perspective, this book really is for all practitioners, students, and scholars of HRD. And we try to make it thought-provoking, interesting, and also fun. And so we hope that you will be the judge of that as you read the book. Laura.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Now we can go on to that next slide. And I know that I'll quote my colleague, Josh Collins, who, when we were asked, is this a critical text or an HRD text? And if you notice the title of the book, the critical perspectives and practices is a subtitle. So we anchor this as a human resource development textbook first and foremost. with alternative ways of thinking about our field. So the book has features you see here now on this slide that you saw a minute ago. So each chapter has boxes that cover objectives of the chapter and an overview at the beginning of each chapter. And then you'll find case studies, points to reflect on or ponder, and tips and tools to apply to practice. And we feel that this is one way that we can take critical ideas and help people understand how to actualize them. So I'm going to talk about the introduction to the book next. So we'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. And we start with a chapter on history of HRD. And I love this chapter in particular because it talks about things in HRD that I never knew and voices I never heard that were not ever dominant. So it's a wonderful way to start the book. And the quote that begins the book is, "History is never for itself, it's always for someone." And the question is, whose voice is privileged? And then kind of also interrogating paradigms in the next chapter, which is chapter 2, meta-narratives of human resource development. And this chapter really goes into lots of different ways that we talk about and interpret human resource development, starting with the quote by Kuhn, which is considered one of the most famous quotes, I believe, in research in terms of how we use paradigms as a way of interpreting the world. And so in chapter 2, one of the featured boxes is, oops, can we go back? Is box 2.1, points to ponder, an example of misogynistic discourse. And so this activity actually focuses on the Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard's misogyny speech. And so there's an opportunity to link to the very provocative video and then questions for reflection. So you'll see activities like this throughout the book. And so these 2 chapters introduce the book and I think set the foundation for the book that does seek to disrupt traditional ways of thinking about HRD in terms of our research, practice, and teaching. And at the same time, taking an unvarnished look at the realities and complexities of working in organizations filled with humans. So we hope that you will enjoy this, and I will turn things over to our next speaker who will take you through the next section of the book, which is relating.
Eunbi, you're in mute. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. I'm probably too nervous. Anyhow, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Eunbi Sim, a 3rd year international PhD student in the LLB program at the University of Georgia. And Dr. Bierema is my advisor. I feel extremely privileged to be a part of this fantastic critical HRD team as a graduate research assistant. And as a PhD student, it's a huge honor for me to introduce this book. And today I'm very excited to introduce the relating section of the critical HRD model, which happens to be my favorite. And this relating aspect of the critical HRD model highlights critical HRD's commitment to people by emphasizing how people treat each other and connect at all levels of the organization. And this relating section answers the principal question, whom do we serve, through the 3 chapters, stakeholders and power, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, and work relationships. And I want to start with a quote emphasizing the importance of relationships. So yeah, human relationships always help us to carry on because they always presuppose further developments of future, and also because we live as if our only task was precisely to have relationship with other people. So the relating section focuses on exploring the role of HRD in work relationships, and not only at individual level, but also at organization level, such as recruiting, onboarding, and developing, and then provides useful tips and tools to maintain and facilitate healthy and sustainable work relationships, which can be found in chapter 5. And then going back to chapter 3, titled Stakeholders and Power, the authors discuss the concept of power in relating, which is also captured in the second quote, power is embedded in the relational shaping of the world. Chapter 3 helps readers understand the meaning of stakeholders and the power dynamics among them. So this chapter also prompts readers to consider the question, in whose interest does this serve? I found this chapter to be very informative, as it clarified me distinction between stakeholders and stockholders, introduces various types and effects of power, and provided strategies to address instability. Additionally, the chapter covered critical approaches to leadership and knowledge management. Lastly, the chapter 4 of the book is my favorite. It talks about EDRD, so equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, which is different from just DEI. So this chapter emphasizes the importance of decolonization in promoting social justice within an organization. I consider myself as an intersectional feminist, so I found this section on intersectionality and the mapping your identity activity to be particularly interesting. The activity involves listening participants' social identities and reflect on how these overlapping identities affect the work. So the relating section also provides many tips and cases related to work relationship, power, and EDID. So I believe you all will find them helpful. And then I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Collins, who will be presenting about the learning section.
Thank you, Eunbi. My name is Josh Collins. I'm an associate professor of HRD and the director of undergraduate studies in organizational leadership, policy, and development at the University of Minnesota. I'm also a current board member of the Academy of HRD. Today, I'm happy to introduce the learning section of our book. This section really seeks to disrupt performative foundations, as Laura was mentioning, of what it means to learn and to be a learner in the context of HRD. And so we worked really diligently, I think, to decenter some of the more mechanistic understandings of learning, and instead built a perspective in this book that I think works around the idea that a worker's learning priorities may differ from what the organization wants to learn. So, for example, this is an example I use with my students to illustrate this concept, is if you think about something like a tech startup, while the organization might prioritize learning new programming and really getting up to speed on latest cutting edge technologies, an employee might find value in developing effective communication, looking at things like conflict resolution, because those are the things that characterize the day-to-day work in a startup context, right? So I think that this divergence creates a nuanced environment where learning objectives can be at odds. And so the learning section really emphasizes the ways that HRD is affected by that kind of context through stakeholders with different perspectives on what learning should be. And this line of questioning leads us to promote practices such as critical reflection and active learning. So chapter 6, which is entitled Learning Theory and Practice, begins with a well-known quote from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. I think that chapter 6 really serves to provide an overview of learning theory and practice as they relate to the field of HRD. And we offer the following definition of learning. Learning is a process of transforming the basis of one's knowledge, skill, and attitude to create the potential for behavioral change. So in chapter 6, we look at things like andragogy. We talk about self-direction, different philosophies of learning, from behaviorism to constructivism, formal, non-formal, incidental learning. And we conclude the chapter with the questions: in whose interests do HRD interventions primarily serve, profit or people? How can those interests be more balanced? And we propose that developing answers to these questions must begin with and involve encouraging HRD scholars and practitioners to interrogate the types of learning that are most engaging to them. My favorite points to ponder in chapter 6 ask the reader to reflect on their own learning experiences and to consider whether or not they benefit more from when they're interacting with new material, whether that's best informed by more passive forms of learning via lecture or via experience. Moving to chapter 7, which focuses on adult learning discourses and practices in HRD, we open with a quote from the late U.S. representative and really a pillar of the U.S. civil rights movement, John Lewis, who said, "Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." So this quote, I think, really serves to remind us of the importance of activism in any setting in order to inspire change, something that I think I really see at the forefront of a lot of my students' minds, especially undergraduates, but graduate students as well, as they look at a world that often feels that it's becoming more hostile, more violent. There's more disagreement. People are resistant to change. There's a lot of inequity. So those are the concerns that I see being at the front of my students' minds. And I think that this chapter really discusses the power of dominant discourse in HRD, our definitions for adult learning and development, dilemmas and discourses surrounding training and training effectiveness. And my favorite part of chapter 7 is the section where we continue to unpack the false dichotomy of learning versus performance. As Laura was, I think, discussing earlier, a conversation that has unfortunately dominated HRD conferences, journals, classrooms, and practices now for decades. So in alignment with the late Phyllis Cunningham's early critiques of what she observed in HRD conferences, we state emphatically that learning should not be subordinate to performance, that performance cannot be effective without learning, and that learning is a prerequisite to many activities, including performance. The exercise I'll highlight from chapter 7 invites practitioners to compare managerial and employee perceptions of employee job responsibilities, and then use a mutual process for determining what are the discrepancies in the way those job responsibilities look according to the employee and the manager, and use that as a springboard to discuss expectations and priorities. Obviously, this is just a very quick summary I'm able to provide in our brief time together today. We really believe that our discussion of learning and adult education has the capacity to help reimagine the priorities of the field. And we're really excited by the possibilities that we hope are opened up through these perspectives. If I'm not mistaken, I believe up next is my colleague, Dr. Tomika Greer.
Thank you, Josh. Hi, everyone. I am Tomika Greer. I'm an assistant professor of human resource development at the University of Houston, and also the undergraduate program coordinator and a current board member for the Academy of Human Resource Development. It is absolutely my honor and privilege to be here today with my esteemed colleagues and to tell you more about this book that we have put out into the world. Finally. So the changing part of critical HRD, I think it's important to note that I do follow Josh talking about learning, and what happens when we learn is that we change. So change is all about modifying and altering our mindsets, our behaviors, and even structures and processes within spaces of organizing. And the thing about change is that it can be intentional. So something that we can plan and we can try to manipulate in some ways so that it happens the way we want it to. But change can also be unintentional or unplanned. And so sometimes it's just thrust upon us. It just happens. And the thing about change is that it will happen. It has to happen, for better or worse. Nothing can stay the same. I have a good friend who on more than one occasion has reminded me that You can never step into the same river twice, okay? So every time you put your foot in there, there's some different water molecules there, right? And so change happens intentionally, unintentionally, planned or unplanned. And what HRD does, and critical HRD in particular, is that one, we're going to respond to unplanned change. So when unplanned change happens, what do we then do in order to take advantage of the change that's happening and leave our people in a place that's better than before the change, right? And then we also can facilitate when it's a planned change initiative, okay? So with the critical perspective on change, we have to think about if we don't change, then we basically are left with the status quo. And often the status quo can be maybe oppressive for some, it can be inequitable for some, it can be unjust for some, it can limit access for some. And so we use tools, well, we use change as a tool to correct some of those things, right? From a critical perspective. So we have 2 chapters in this book that are dedicated to the changing nature of critical HRD. And in the first one, we talk about the theory and the practice of change. And this really is kind of some of the things I'm talking about now, like what is change? How does it occur? And one of my favorite things about that chapter is encouraging to the reader to think about what happens when change is perceived as a failure. And how do we recover from that? How do we pick up the pieces from that, right? Knowing that sometimes it will be perceived as a failure, right? And a key aspect of that is knowing why we are in this change, what our ultimate outcomes and goals are. Okay. And then the second chapter on change is designing and implementing HRD interventions. And this really takes a planned change perspective. Like, what is a systematic way that we can see something that needs to change and take steps to change it and realize a different future or a different reality in the end. Okay. And what I like, one of my favorite things about this chapter as well is we really highlight the role of leadership in change initiatives and how critical thinking, critical perspectives of the leader can help to correct inequities and injustices and inequitable access and those sorts of things as the change is occurring. And just the importance of having someone that is leading these initiatives with critical perspectives in mind. So that's chapter 8 and chapter 9 of our book, which is all about changing. And so it is now my privilege to hand it over to Dr. Carole Elliott, who will talk about organizing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tomika, for that introduction. So I'm Carole Elliott. I'm based at Sheffield University Management School in the UK, where I'm Professor of Organisation Studies. And I'm just going to be talking about the organising section of this book, which is actually the 4th aspect of the Bierema Callahan critical HRD model that Laura and Jamie introduced at the start. So in this section, we explore how the space of organising has been conceptualised and operationalised as a means of enacting people in the work of the enterprise. And just a bit of background about me, I suppose. My work in critical HRD, certainly in the early years, has really been informed by the critical management studies literature very broadly and critical theories intent to draw intention and attention to power relationships. So the organising section addresses a question of great importance to us all. How do critical HRD professionals realise the power of organising structures and the creation of cultures that support human sustainability and well-being? And I think our book is the first that really does place a great focus on spaces and places and processes of organising within HRD, which has been touched upon, but not in the same depth as we do in this particular book. So we do all this by highlighting organising as something that happens through context, through stakeholders, and through process. So the quotation at the top of this slide is from Miles Horton's autobiography, The Long Haul, which tells the story of the Highlander Folk School, an organization that has been a major catalyst for social change in the US since the 1930s. His quote alludes to the challenges of organizing, and like many contemporary forms of organizing that equate organizing to a process of command and control, Horton's suggestion in this quote is to allow yourself space to breathe when organizing for change, which hints at our concern for advocacy that Jamie and Laura outlined at the start of this presentation. So the organising section consists of 2 chapters, Chapter 10, Constructing Organisations, and Chapter 11, Accountability in Human Resource Development. The second quote on this slide is from our esteemed colleague, Dr. Jamie Callahan, where she says an organisation can be defined as a relatively voluntary collective of actors committed to interacting toward a mutually constructed and interpreted endeavour or set of endeavours. So for me, I really love this quote because it hints at the complexity we face in creating and developing organisations or spaces of organising. The underlying value assumption is that members of an organisation have a collective voice in identifying what they will do. The emphasis is not on the ends or goals, but on the process of interaction. But the quote also subtly alludes to the necessity of recognising and negotiating power relationships, which, given the text, our concern with critical perspectives is significant and important to recognise. So I'm going to finish my overview of this organising section by briefly mentioning why we've included the case in point of the Akashinga All-Women Ranger Programme, which can be found in the accountability chapter. I really love this case, the organisation itself, which I found out about shortly before my travel to an Academy of HRD conference a couple of years ago. It's an illustration of how organising differently can be inclusive and benefit individuals, societies, and the environment. So briefly, the Akashinga programme is an all-woman anti-poaching unit whose aim is to build an alternative to the Western conceived militarized approach to wildlife conservation, which defends colonial boundaries between nature and humans. Its community-driven conservation model empowering disadvantaged women to restore and manage a network of wilderness areas as an alternative to trophy hunting. Briefly, the example, we use this example of the Akashinga approach to anti-poaching as an illustration of how recognizing accountability for action has real consequences for the lives of other individuals, local communities, and social and ecological environments. And at that point, I will hand back over to Dr. Jamie Callahan. Thank you.
Thanks, Carole. I'm back again, and I'm really delighted to tell you a bit more about the final section of the book, which is Practicing HRD Holistically. And this section pulls our 4 framework sections together. And the idea of holistic is that the parts of something are interconnected and interdependent, and they really have to be understood as a whole. Practicing critical HRD really demands applying a holistic mindset and viewing the role of HRD practitioners as advocacy for all stakeholders. In Chapter 12, we talk about critical interventions. And Laura Bierema has argued that good consultants work themselves out of a job. And this chapter addresses the distinctions between traditional interventions and critical interventions. While Chapter 9 talked about how to plan HRD interventions, Chapter 12 builds on those ideas and offers in-the-moment interventions that have a critical orientation. And this is where one of my favorite call-out box pairs, if you will, comes in. So box 12.1 and 12.2 are both about tempered radicalism. 12.1 is a case study of an HRD professional who was given a relatively straightforward task and how she leveraged that task to meet the objective while also serving sustainable environmental interests and revealing gender and ethnicity pay gaps, providing participants the tools to make their own evaluations of the organization's practices and policies. She engaged in what's called tempered radicalism. Well, box 12.2 that I show on the slide follows up with that and provides a series of tips and tools for different ways of engaging in tempered radicalism. And Chapter 13 is one of my favorite HRD topics to teach, evaluation. Two of the biggest influences in my passion for evaluation are Darlene Russ-Eft and Hallie Preskill. Their significant body of work helping HRD professionals engage in evaluation activities beyond the smile sheets that we so frequently see has been a huge influence on my practice. And their work tends to be largely traditional in nature. And I found myself asking the classic critical question, in whose interest does this serve? And this chapter can help HRD professionals really interrogate who the stakeholders of evaluation are and how to assess their interests. So it provides different perspective of the rationale for engaging in evaluation, which is depicted in table 13.1 here on the slide. This chapter asks HRD professionals to follow Linda Tuhiwai Smith's call to evaluators. The challenge is always to demystify, to decolonize. And we hope that this chapter gives you an introduction to not only some of the traditional forms of evaluation, but also some more critical forms and perspectives of evaluation. And the final chapter, much of our book brings us to the future of the field of HRD. And as Pinchot said, in the fight for conservation, the vast possibilities of our great future will become realities only if we make ourselves, in a sense, responsible for that future. We can become more responsible when we think holistically, retrospectively, and prospectively about trends that we feel are and will be influencing our practice of critical HRD. And the ongoing effect of COVID-19, as you hear in my voice right now, remote work, health and well-being, digitization, all of those are amongst some of the issues that we address, using critical perspective to interrogate those issues. And so in conclusion for the content of the book, I wanted to scroll us back to chapter 4. The opening quote from that chapter is from the novel The Overstory by Richard Powers. And he says, "You can't see what you don't understand, but what you think you already understand, you'll fail to notice." To me, this quote serves not only to remind us to pay attention to the issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization of chapter 4, but also as a reminder that all of our practice requires a search for understandings and new understandings. We need to always be interrogating our practice to notice anew that which we think we already understand. So we hope that this book helps you do that, as it certainly helped all of us do that. And finally, to the next slide, I want to thank you for attending. And for those of you who have attended, we've also secured a 30% book discount for those of you who've participated in the webinar. So thank you very much for attending, and we'll now turn it over to a dialogue on questions and comments that you may have. So thank you again. Or we can talk more.
Well, let me just mention the discount code for the book is in the chat. So we invite you to buy our book. We also would love it if you'd provide reviews of it. So either on Amazon or consider writing a review for a journal. But we would love your questions and comments. And as Jamie said, this group is not shy, so we can also just talk. So one thing I will also mention is we are doing an innovative session at the upcoming Academy of Human Resource Development Conference in the United States in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks. And there we will be talking about the process of collaboratively writing this book. And that was also rather interesting. So we also welcome questions about collaboration and what worked and maybe what didn't. And Dr. Gedra, we would love a question from you if you have one. Oh, here we go. So I'll read it and then pose it to the panel. How can HR practitioners and academics participate in undoing the gendered, racial, heterosexual, ableist, et cetera, regimes of inequality within organizations and organizing? And how does this book help us in thinking along these lines? And while we did talk about it, please offer some examples. Okay, who wants to tackle that?
I
I'm
can
throwing this over to
start.
Josh. Okay, perfect. I was going to say, let's throw this to Josh, and there you go.
So one thing that I would offer is that this book offers very concrete definitions for the terms that are central to the issues that have been raised here. So we offer concrete definitions for diversity, equity, inclusion, and decolonization. I think that that's the first time that I've seen such clear definitions for those terms offered in our field. So I would say that's a starting place. And one helpful way to utilize that in organizations is maybe to provide those definitions in conversations and allow people to respond to them and maybe have an opportunity to contextualize them within specific organizational settings. I think, the book also has many examples that we could point to. I think one of the examples that I would mention is related to some of my own work in terms of looking at among even people who hold marginalized identities, whether that's racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, to look at the ways that we, and I say we as a member of one of those communities, we often perpetuate systems that harm other marginalized groups, and the way that liberating ourselves is related to the liberation of others. And I think that I've seen that show up in my data with people that I've interviewed in various types of organizational settings. I'll stop there, and Jamie, if you want to hop in.
I was actually looking at the next question as well. So I don't know if we should hang on this for a little bit longer, or if I should address the question that Julie raised.
I want to add just to what Joshua said.
Please, Tomika, yes.
Before we go to Julie's question, kind of that middle section there, how does this book help us in thinking along these lines? I just really want to drive home the fact that every single chapter really drives home how do we think critically about every aspect of HRD as we know it, right? So we take all of the things that have previously been known about HRD, right, from a practitioner standpoint and certainly from a research standpoint as well, and we examine it, we expose the assumptions in it, okay? So throughout the book, in any topic that you're interested in, you're going to see how to possibly alter your thinking so that it is more critical.
Thanks, Josh and Tomika. Yeah, I really feel that I'll wrap up, and then I'll move on to Julie's question. I really think that we did spend a lot of time thinking about how do we address these issues, and you'll see throughout most of the chapters where we are addressing how do we undo those gendered, racial, heterosexist, ableist, et cetera, regimes of inequality. Those issues are woven throughout most of the chapters in terms of how do we think about this in relation to stakeholders in power? How do we think about these issues in relation to leadership? How do we think about these issues in relation to changing? So you'll find it throughout the book. In terms of the next question, to give some airtime to one of the other questions, we were asked, how do we build a bridge to HRM with these insights? And while this book is very clearly about human resource development, we do see the two subdisciplines of human resources working hand in hand. One of the things that I share with my students is that we have the idea of human resources at the top of an apex, and working side by side are human resource development and human resource management. That those two are not, HRD is not subsumed underneath management. And I ask students to address the difference between what does it mean to manage something, what does it mean to develop something? And so if we place them one under the other, they're competing with one another. So we place them by the side. We place them side by side because they're complement, and they occur at different interconnected stages within an employee's career and an organization's working with employees. So I think if we take the idea of, if we develop our employees such that they feel safe, they feel that they can contribute, that they can grow, that they can develop, they can learn, they can contribute to the change and the development of the organization, which in turn gives back to them, then a lot of our human resource management problems go away. So it is one of those situations where we look at human resource development as complementary to human resource management. And we hope that the critical perspective that we take on developing people who work within organizations and the organizations themselves, that taking critical perspective here will help human resource managers to also be more comfortable with the idea of taking a critical perspective and challenging the assumptions within human resource management as well.
Yeah, I'll just add something there to what Jamie has said, if I may. I mean, I was going to say exactly that, Jamie, and they're symbiotic with each other. One, certainly within formal organizing processes and structures, which have strategic priorities. You know, we know all these terms and we live with them, most of us in the organizations in which we work. One has to live, they have to live alongside each other. And I think if we think of HRM at a strategic level, in order for that to succeed, for an organization to be healthy, to ensure the well-being of its staff, to ensure the organization's development, and that people are free and have the ability to and the space to learn and develop, then we must keep conversing and we must understand each other. If we think of HRM as something that is just about commanding and controlling, then I would suggest that that's probably where organizations start to die, because it is a very narrow view and it's a very short-termist way of managing organizations with that particular perspective. So I would think the more sustainable an organization is, the more likely it is to work an HRM function that has that balances both the need to organize systems of work, etc., and processes, alongside the need to be developmental and to continue to learn and reflect on that learning.
I'll offer just a general reflection about the book. I know that some people may see critical in the title and think, well, I'm not a critical person. And yet, yeah, I think by virtue of all of the inequity and injustice in organizations, a critical perspective actually provides the tools, analysis, language, and practices to challenge that, to create more equitable workplaces and make them humanly sustainable. And so I think that is really our commitment, and why we have worked so hard to take what can be very elusive concepts of criticality and critical theory and putting them into practice. So just wanted to underscore that.
Another thing that I hope I don't intend to throw any of my colleagues under the bus here, but I know that the book is already being used in the classroom. I've not been able to yet, but I think Jamie has and Josh has. So I don't know, again, sorry if I'm volunteering you to speak on an issue you might not want to speak about, but did you have any highlights or any reflections on actually using the book in the classroom setting?
I would just very briefly say I've been using it in my relationship with my doctoral advisees, in particular, a lot of whom hold more critical and social justice oriented perspectives. And those students in particular have responded very, very well to this book and its disruption of the foundations of the discipline. I have also shared it with my more performative colleagues, and they have a similarly supportive view of the book, which I think is also quite encouraging. And so from my vantage point, the reception has been very open, and students and faculty alike seem to be really happy to see a different way of framing issues that are important for the field. But I think maybe Jamie might have some different experiences to share.
I do have in general good experiences. So I've used it now. I'm using it for my second semester. I used it, the draft of it last year in my class on for master students on human resource development. And it was extremely well received. I also used it in the certification module for individuals who are getting their Chartered Institute of Personnel Development certification. Last year, it was extremely well received. And I think a big part of that is because the book helped students contextualize what was going on with the very widespread industrial action that was going on throughout the UK in higher education last year. So people had a better understanding of what was happening, and that action was forcing them to take a critical view of their own organization that they were sitting in. So it was really helpful in that regard. And it was widely well received. This year, I have a group of students who really find it fascinating and have never thought of HRD in that way. They've never been encouraged to think in critical ways. And for them, it's a breath of fresh air. I have a smaller group of students who are much more performative and dominant paradigm, and they would prefer me to just tell them what I want them to know, but they would prefer me to tell them things that don't make them think quite as hard. And these are challenging their assumptions. They just want to know, what does career development mean? What does training and development mean? And what are some of the key steps and recipes that I can follow? And this whole book is not about giving people recipes. It's about giving people a series of different kinds of tools to help them understand. And it's engaging the learner in learning for themselves. Yes, and as Josh points out, we're intentional, but we're not prescriptive in the book. And so for those students who come in with a prescriptive mindset, it takes them a few sessions before they're willing to kind of understand that there are alternative ways of thinking. And this puts a lot of power back to them, which can also be scary sometimes for instructors to give that much power back to students in the classroom. So in general, it has been well received. Students really like the call out boxes that we have, the points to ponder, the different tools where they can go places and explore more. And it also pulls together ideas for case studies that we then frequently do in class. So they're already prepared for those and have thought about it so they can engage more. Most of the students that I have do not speak English as a first language. So it gives them a little bit more time to think, reflect, and then participate in class. So those are some of the positive things. Much like Mary Jo Hatch's book on organizational culture back in the late 1990s was known as the Red Book, I call ours the Purple Book.
And I love that because purple is my favorite color after all. Well, I want to just make a couple comments about one other question in the chat, which was just to talk about our collaborative process. So I'll offer a few thoughts and then probably we'll need to conclude. So I want to give a shout out to our wonderful colleagues, Sharon Maven and Sally Sambrick, who were originally on the writing team. And both of them rolled off the project for various reasons due to job changes and retirement. And then we brought Josh and Tomika onto the team. But, I think one of the big things, mindsets we all had to get beyond was we were doing something new and a bit risky and something we didn't really know how to do. And I think we all coached each other through that at various points in time. To build confidence, to stray from the dominant discourse and paradigms. How we did that in practical terms is every single Monday morning, most of the time, we had a standing virtual writing retreat for 2 to 3 hours. Now, not everybody attended every time, but pretty much there were 2 or 3 of us or 5 of us in that room. And then we would meet at the beginning, check in, perhaps do a writing prompt, talk about what was working, what was not. And then we would all turn off our cameras and our audio, but we would check back in then at the top of the hour. And, you know, it's a simple thing, but it was an accountability check. And it also really forced us to kind of keep up with the writing in a more consistent way. So I think that that for me was really helpful. And then we each tag teamed on the chapters. So for instance, if I wrote chapter 1, I would hand it off to Tomika to give a really critical review. And so we had one of us review each of the chapters. And I think that that also really helped strengthen and unify our voice as writers.
So as we come up to just 2 minutes before the top of the hour, really, we all want to thank all of you for attending. This was an exciting process for us. We are hopeful and we believe that this will really change the nature of the way we think of human resource development, and that critical perspectives will become more of a common normal, this is just the way you look at the field. We hope that you'll take advantage of the book discount and use the book, and we hope that you find it as useful in understanding the field as writing it helped us understand the field much more. So thank you all very much for coming.
I think you're muted. We can't hear it.
Yeah. It was a fabulous discussion, and I'm really charged up to, in fact, to grab a copy of your book. And that's something that this has interested me, and I'll look forward to reading your book and discussing it within my classroom for human resource development. Uh, Finally, as we have no more questions, we have come to the end of the webinar. A huge thank you to Dr. Laura, Dr. Jamie, Dr. Carole, Dr. Tomika, Dr. Joshua, Eunbi Sim for sharing your insights into the basic tenets of human resources development and how to critically assess HRD practices and outcomes, and critical alternative to the instrumentalist, managerialist, and masculine perspective that other books offer. Before we close, just wanted to draw everyone's attention to our forthcoming events. We have on 29th of Feb, out of the press webinar series, Projectification of Organizations, Governance, and Societies, which will be led by Mats and Malin, Peter, Steve. So do join us, in fact, for this interesting webinar. Do follow us on Twitter. Our handle is CMS in Touch to keep up to date with announcements and events information. We are also on LinkedIn, so do connect with us. Don't forget to check our YouTube channel, where you will find recordings of all our previous webinars, and this one will be uploaded there soon. Also, if you have some ideas and would like to organize a webinar workshop, please write to us at cmswebinars@gmail.com. Thank you once again to the author team, as well as my fellow CMS colleagues who joined us today, Alex, Munib, and Richard. And then thank you to all the attendees and who joined us today from different time zones. See you next time. CMS in Touch is signing off. Keep safe, take care, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.